At 5:24 in the morning on October 23, 1944, a torpedo moving at 46 knots tore through the steel hull of a 13,000-ton Japanese heavy cruiser and detonated inside her boiler rooms. The explosion vaporized 300 men in less time than it takes to draw a single breath. Steam erupted through the decks like a volcano. Fire climbed the superstructure in sheets of orange and white. The ship, Atago, the personal flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the man chosen to command Japan's last great naval offensive, began listing to starboard within seconds, and the man who was supposed to save the Japanese Empire was now climbing through a shattered window and throwing himself into a sea burning with oil. 2 submarines, 6 torpedoes, 21 minutes. That was all it took to crack the spine of the most powerful fleet Japan had left on Earth. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe the most important battles in history were won not by empires, but by ordinary men who refused to accept the impossible. Here is what nobody tells you about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The moment that decided everything did not happen when the giant guns fired. It did not happen when the aircraft carriers launched their planes. It did not even happen during the famous standoff the island of Samar that would go down in legend. It happened in the dark, before dawn, in a narrow stretch of water called Palawan Passage, when 2 American submarine commanders, men who had spent the previous week bored, waiting, and finding nothing but empty sea, stumbled onto the largest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining in the Pacific Ocean and made a decision that military textbooks would later call tactically insane. They surfaced, in the dark, in waters crawling with Japanese destroyers, and they ran at full speed directly toward an armada of battleships. In the next 60 minutes of this story, we will watch an empire unravel. By the end of October 1944, Japan would lose 34 ships, more than 12,500 sailors, and every realistic chance it had left to win the war in the Pacific. But it all started here, in the dark, with 2 men nobody in Tokyo had ever heard of. By October of 1944, the Japanese Empire was dying, and its leaders knew it. The outer ring of island defenses that had once seemed impenetrable had been smashed one fortress at a time. Saipan fell in July. Guam fell in August. Tinian fell shortly after. Each island lost brought American B-29 bombers closer to the skies above Tokyo, closer to the factories, the shipyards, the cities packed with civilians who had been told for years that Japan was winning. But the true catastrophe was happening somewhere nobody could see. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, American submarines had transformed Japan's shipping lanes into graveyards. Oil tankers that left Borneo loaded with fuel vanished before they ever reached the home islands. Entire convoys disappeared without a single distress call. The captains of those ships never had time to send one. The fuel shortage that resulted was so severe that some of Japan's mightiest warships sat anchored in harbor, idle and useless, simply because there was not enough oil left to move them across open water. An empire that had once swept across half the Pacific in a matter of months, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, was now slowly suffocating in place. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers and the majority of its experienced aviators at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June. The Army was being ground down on every front. American industrial production was generating warships, aircraft, and equipment at a pace Japan could not begin to match. The math was brutal and simple. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. Every week the war continued. The gap widened. And yet Japan's military leadership clung to a single desperate belief, one that had become almost religious in its fervor. They believed that one perfectly executed, catastrophic blow could reverse everything, not win the war outright. They were not delusional enough to believe that anymore, but cause enough American casualties that the United States might negotiate a peace rather than accept years more of horrific bloodshed. They called this strategy Shō-Gō, the victory operation, The target was Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were preparing the largest amphibious invasion in the Pacific War. Hundreds of transport ships loaded with troops, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies would be anchored in that Gulf, vulnerable, exposed, doing the slow and unglamorous work of unloading an army onto a beach. If Japan could destroy those transports, tens of thousands of American soldiers would be stranded on open sand with no reinforcements and no way home. The invasion of the Philippines would collapse. American public opinion, already growing weary of the war's cost, might force the Roosevelt administration to the negotiating table. It was a gamble of breathtaking recklessness, and Tokyo had decided it was the only gamble left. 3 separate Japanese naval forces would converge on Leyte from 3 different directions simultaneously. A 4th force, built from nearly empty aircraft carriers with barely enough planes to fill their decks, would dangle itself to the north as bait. Its job was to lure away Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the most dangerous American naval force in the Pacific, and keep it occupied long enough for the main attack to reach Leyte. At the heart of the entire operation stood what the Japanese called the Center Force. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers. Among them sailed Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed by any nation in the history of warfare. Each one displaced 65,000 tons of steel. Each one carried 9 guns of 46 centimeters in diameter, guns so enormous that their shells weighed as much as a small automobile and could be fired more than 40 kilometers. The designers of these ships had built them to win the decisive fleet battle that Japanese naval doctrine had always dreamed of, a clash of giants where superior Japanese guns and Japanese courage would overcome American numerical advantage. If Kurita's center force reached Leyte Gulf intact, the slaughter would be total. But to get there, his armada first had to pass through a long, narrow stretch of water running along the western coast of Palawan Island. The water was called Palawan Passage. American submariners had given it a different name. They called it Submarine Alley. Commander David McClintock was 35 years old. He had grown up in the American Midwest, far from any ocean, in the kind of small town where the most exciting thing that happened in a given week was the Friday night high school football game. He was not a naval hero out of a Hollywood film. He was sharp, patient, methodical, and possessed of a quality that is rarer than most people realize: the ability to remain calm when everything around him is chaos. McClintock commanded the USS Darter, a Gato-class submarine that had been prowling the waters around the Philippines for the better part of 2 weeks. With him ran his sister boat, USS Dace, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett. The 2 submarines had been operating as a team, sharing intelligence and coordinating their patrols, hunting for Japanese shipping that never seemed to appear in their sector. The crews of both submarines were a cross-section of wartime America. Welders from Pennsylvania, farm boys from Iowa who had never seen the ocean before enlisting, mechanics who had been fixing automobile engines in roadside garages 2 years earlier, and were now responsible for maintaining the complex machinery that kept a submarine alive 100 feet beneath the surface. A cook from New Jersey who had been making sandwiches at a diner when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and who now prepared meals for 40 men in a kitchen the size of a closet. While outside the hull, the Pacific Ocean pressed in at thousands of pounds per square inch. None of them were soldiers in the traditional sense. They were ordinary American young men who had been handed an extraordinary responsibility and had spent 2 years learning how to carry it. By October 22nd, morale aboard Darter was running low. Patrols that produced no contacts, no attacks, no results, wore on men in ways that combat sometimes did not. The waiting, the uncertainty, the endless routine of life in a metal tube beneath the ocean, these things had a way of hollowing men out slowly. McClintock was an experienced enough commander to see it in the faces of his crew. They needed something to happen. Something was about to happen. At 0:17 hours on October 23, 1944, the radar operator aboard Darter leaned closer to his glowing green screen. A contact, then another, then a dozen. then more than he could quickly count. He called for the officer of the watch. The officer stared at the screen. He called for McClintock. McClintock looked at the display and understood immediately that what he was seeing was not a convoy. Convoys had a signature, a rough cluster of overlapping returns moving in loose formation. What the radar was showing him was something organized, something structured, something enormous moving in precise lines through the darkness. This was a fleet. He grabbed the radio handset and raised Dace. The message was short. Multiple contacts, large formation, moving east. Aboard Dace, exhaustion evaporated. Men who had been half asleep shook themselves awake. Officers bent over charts. Claggett and McClintock began talking through what they were seeing, comparing radar returns, calculating speed and heading. The math confirmed what their instincts already told them. They had just found the largest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining in the Pacific. And now came the decision that would define everything that followed. The Japanese fleet was moving at high speed, more than 16 knots based on the radar tracking. A submerged submarine in 1944 could manage perhaps 9 knots on battery power, and only for a short time before the batteries were dangerously depleted. Submerged, there was no possible way for either Darter or Dace to get ahead of the Japanese formation and into a firing position before the fleet had passed. If they were going to attack, they had to surface. They had to run on diesel engines at maximum speed through open water, in darkness, in sea lanes controlled by Japanese destroyers equipped with their own radar, to get far enough ahead of the enemy fleet to submerge and position themselves for a torpedo attack before dawn made them visible from the air. The distance they needed to cover was significant. The time they had was limited. The risk was absolute. A single Japanese destroyer detecting them on radar while they ran on the surface could pin both submarines in a crossfire. The destroyers would radio the fleet. The entire armada would maneuver around them. Every ship in the formation would be at battle stations, guns aimed at the spot where the submarines had last been seen. Getting away would require luck that no submarine crew could count on. McClintock did not hesitate. Surface. All ahead full. The diesel engines on both submarines thundered to life simultaneously. Exhaust smoke scattered on the tropical wind. The boats accelerated to 17 knots, their bows cutting through the dark water, spray flying white against the Black Sea. They ran parallel courses, separated by several miles, both pushing their engines to their limits, both aware that every minute on the surface was a minute of maximum exposure. And McClintock did something else. He broke radio silence and transmitted a contact report directly to American Fleet Headquarters. Enemy fleet sighted. Composition confirmed. Course and speed provided. Position coordinates attached. That single transmission, received by American headquarters hours before the Japanese had any idea they had been spotted, stripped Operation Shō-Gō of its most essential ingredient. Surprise was gone before the sun rose. What neither McClintock nor Claggett knew yet was that their target was making a fatal mistake of its own. Vice Admiral Kurita, under pressure to maintain his schedule and keep his fleet in precise formation for the approach to San Bernardino Strait, had made a decision that submariners dream about and admirals spend careers trying to prevent. To hold his ships together in the darkness, he ordered them to stop zigzagging. Standard anti-submarine doctrine for any fleet operating in potentially hostile waters was constant course changes, unpredictable weaving that made it impossible for a submerged submarine to calculate the firing solution needed for an accurate torpedo spread. Zigzagging was survival. Kurita's fleet was now sailing in a straight, steady, perfectly predictable line. Both submarines raced ahead in the dark, checked their position, dove beneath the surface, and waited. Inside Darter, the world contracted to the size of a control room. Engines went silent. Men breathed quietly. The sounds of the submarine became the creak of the hull and the soft electronic hum of instruments and the ticking of chronometers. Torpedo crews made their final checks. Fire control officers bent over their calculating equipment, feeding in the numbers that would define the shot. McClintock raised the periscope in the gray pre-dawn light and put his eye to the lens. First he saw the destroyers, spread wide in a screen ahead of the main formation. Then the shapes of cruisers materialized from the darkness. Then something larger. Then something larger still. And then, filling the entire field of the periscope lens, the bow of a heavy cruiser moving at high speed with a bone of white water in her teeth, and the flag of the Imperial Japanese Navy flying from her mainmast. It was Atago, Kurita's flagship. The man who commanded Japan's last great offensive was less than 1,000 yards away. Earlier in the war, American torpedoes had been a source of bitter frustration. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon in the American submarine fleet, had been plagued by defective detonators that failed to trigger on contact, depth controls that caused the weapons to run far deeper than set, and a tendency to circle back toward the submarine that had fired them. Countless perfect attacks had ended in heartbreak. Torpedoes that should have killed ships instead ran harmlessly beneath their hulls or struck and simply failed to explode. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent years denying the problem existed while submarine crews died, wondering why their weapons would not work. By late 1944, the problems had finally been fixed. The Mark 18 electric torpedo carried by both darter and dace was a reliable, deadly weapon. When it struck a ship, that ship died. McClintock steadied his breathing, confirmed his firing solution, and gave the order. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube and began its run toward Atago. The stopwatch started. Fire 2. Another weapon in the water. Fire 3. Fire 4. 6 torpedoes, spread to catch the enemy cruiser across her entire length, were now running hot and straight through the dark water toward the most important target in the Pacific. The silence that followed was the worst part. Men who had spent months training for this moment stood motionless, staring at stopwatches, counting seconds, not breathing, waiting for the ocean to tell them whether they had just changed the war. At 5:24 in the morning, the ocean answered. The first torpedo found Atago's starboard side directly beneath the bridge. The detonation was catastrophic. Steam lines connected to the boiler rooms ruptured and scalded every man in the engine spaces before the fire reached them. 300 sailors in the forward sections of the ship were killed before they understood what was happening. The second torpedo detonated further aft, and the great cruiser shuddered along her entire length, the steel frames groaning and buckling under forces they had never been designed to survive. Lights went out throughout the ship. Emergency systems that were supposed to activate did not. Damage control teams stumbled through smoke-filled corridors trying to reach watertight doors that were already warped shut by the force of the explosions. The third torpedo finished it. Atago began her fatal list to starboard, the angle steepening with every second as the sea poured through her shattered hull. Simultaneously, 3,000 yards away, USS Dace had lined up on the heavy cruiser Maya. Claggett fired a full spread. Maya was struck multiple times and began going under almost immediately, her magazines detonating in a series of secondary explosions that lit the sky above Palawan Passage. Kurita's fleet, which had been sailing in perfect formation seconds before, was now in chaos. On Atago's bridge, the angle of the deck had reached the point where standing upright was no longer possible. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the man on whose courage and judgment Japan had staked its final gamble, looked at his sinking flagship and understood there was nothing left to command. He climbed through a shattered porthole, let go, and fell into the Black Sea. 2 cruisers gone, 200 men floating in burning oil. The commander of Japan's most critical naval operation clinging to a piece of wreckage in the dark, while his staff and his sailors screamed and disappeared around him. And the great battle had not even begun. In Part 2, we will follow what happened when Kurita was pulled from the water and placed aboard the mighty Yamato, still carrying his orders to advance at all costs, and the sky above his wounded fleet filled with American aircraft. Because what was waiting for him in the Sibuyan Sea was going to prove something that Japan's admirals had refused to believe until the evidence was too devastating to deny. The age of the battleship was over, and the most powerful surface fleet on Earth was about to be shown exactly what the future of naval warfare looked like. In 21 minutes off Palawan Passage, 2 American submarines crewed by welders and farm boys tore the head off Japan's last great naval offensive. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita watched his flagship Otago roll over and sink, taking 300 of his men into the dark with her. He was pulled from burning oil and placed aboard the mightiest battleship ever built, Yamato, soaking wet, half-drowned, still carrying orders from Tokyo that had not changed by a single word. Advance to Leyte, at all costs. But surviving the submarines was only the beginning, because waiting for Kurita in the Sibuyan Sea was something his fleet had almost no answer for. In the next 7 hours, American carrier aircraft would fly over 250 combat sorties against his formation. And at the center of the storm, the battleship Musashi, 65,000 tons of steel and armor plate, would absorb more torpedo hits than any warship in history and still refuse to die quickly. The numbers that day would rewrite every assumption naval architects had made for the previous 50 years. And here is where everything got worse. Kurita transferred his flag to Yamato in the pre-dawn darkness, his staff officers helping him aboard, his uniform soaked through, the smell of burning oil still on his skin. The men around him said little. There was little to say. 2 of his heavy cruisers were gone. His command ship was at the bottom of Palawan Passage. The detailed operational schedules that Operation Shō-Gō depended upon had already slipped by the time he climbed Yamato's ladder to the bridge and looked out at his surviving formation. His chief of staff approached him quietly. "Admiral, the reconnaissance report from our aircraft confirms American carrier groups operating east of the Philippines. They will have our position by sunrise." Kurita looked at the horizon, where the sky was just beginning to separate from the sea in the faintest line of gray. "How many carriers?" "Unknown, multiple groups." He said nothing for the long moment. Every officer on the bridge was watching him, waiting for something, some signal that the man who had been commanding Japan's most important fleet was still the same man who had left Linga Roads 4 days ago. What they saw instead was an admiral standing very still, staring at a horizon he could not yet see, calculating odds that were not in his favor. "We continue east," he said finally. "Maintain formation." The Sibuyan Sea was a trap designed by geography. Hemmed in by Philippine islands on 3 sides, it offered almost no room to maneuver a large fleet, and no escape route that did not lead through narrow, well-charted straits. Kurita's force had to cross it to reach San Bernardino Strait and the open water beyond. There was no alternative route. And the Americans knew exactly where he was going. The first radar contacts appeared on Yamato's screens at 0800 hours. Aircraft, multiple groups, approaching from the east. Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commanding Yamato's battle division, turned to his gunnery officer. "All anti-aircraft stations, maximum readiness." He paused. "And tell the men to eat something if they have not. This will take time." It was an understatement of remarkable proportion. The first American wave arrived at 0910. Hellcat fighters came first, suppressing the Japanese combat air patrol, which was thin and disorganized after the losses of the Philippine Sea. Behind the fighters came the Helldiver dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes, peeling off from altitude in coordinated attacks designed to split the anti-aircraft fire and overwhelm individual ships from multiple directions simultaneously. The sea around the Japanese formation erupted. Anti-aircraft shells filled the sky with black bursts. Tracer rounds arced upward in streams of red and white. The noise was enormous, a continuous rolling thunder that made communication between stations nearly impossible without telephones. Japanese gunners worked their weapons with professional discipline, tracking the incoming aircraft, leading them correctly, scoring hits. American planes fell burning into the sea, but more planes kept coming. At the center of the formation, Musashi absorbed the first wave with what seemed like contempt. She was a ship designed to survive exactly this kind of punishment. Her armor belt was 410 millimeters thick at its maximum. Her deck armor had been calculated to defeat plunging bombs from high altitude. Her internal subdivision, the network of watertight compartments that compartmentalized her hull, had been engineered to contain flooding from multiple torpedo hits simultaneously. The first bomb that found her deck detonated against the armored plating and left a crater the size of a dining table, but penetrated nothing critical. The first torpedo that struck her port bow caused flooding in 3 forward compartments. Damage control teams sealed the bulkheads and pumped. Musashi's speed dropped briefly and then recovered. Her guns kept firing. Her captain, Rear Admiral Inoguchi Toshihei, reported to Kurita by radio. "Musashi undamaged in fighting capacity. We continue." The second wave arrived 45 minutes after the first, then a third, then a fourth. The Americans had not come with a single overwhelming strike designed to be deflected by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. They had come with relays, coordinated waves timed to give Japanese gunners no rest, no opportunity to reload and reorganize, no moment when the sky was clear and the next attack could be anticipated and prepared for. By noon, Musashi had absorbed 7 torpedo hits on her port side and 3 bomb strikes on her deck. Her forward trim was off. She was taking water faster than her pumps could remove it, but the flooding was controlled, compartmentalized, manageable. Her engineers reported they could maintain 22 knots. Her guns were still firing. She was wounded, but she was not dying. Then the 5th wave found her. 18 Avenger torpedo bombers split into 2 groups and attacked from both sides simultaneously. It was the attack profile that naval architects had feared most and had hoped the fleet's defensive fire would prevent. 8 torpedoes struck Musashi in a span of 4 minutes. 3 on the starboard side, 5 more on the port. The asymmetric flooding that resulted could not be countered by counterflooding alone. Her list grew past 10 degrees. Her speed dropped to 13 knots. She fell behind the main formation. Inoguchi's voice on the radio was steady. "We are managing the damage. Request permission to maintain position." Kurita granted it. But every officer on Yamato's bridge who looked aft at Musashi's silhouette could see what the radio report was not saying. She was lower in the water than she should have been. The angle of her bow was wrong. She was fighting, but she was fighting a battle that the sea was winning 1 compartment at a time. The Americans smelled it. The 6th wave concentrated entirely on Musashi. Bomb after bomb found her deck now because her anti-aircraft fire was weakening as crew casualties mounted and ammunition was depleted from the guns that had been firing continuously for 6 hours. Torpedo after torpedo struck her hull, each one adding to flooding that the surviving damage control teams, exhausted and working knee-deep in rising water in compartments lit only by emergency lanterns, could no longer contain. The count reached 17 torpedo hits, then 19, then a number her designers had never contemplated because no designer in 1937, when Musashi's keel was laid, had imagined a scenario where a single ship would absorb this much ordnance and still be floating. At 15:20 hours, Musashi's list reached 12 degrees to port and continued increasing. Inoguchi ordered all hands topside. The men came up from below, some of them burned, some of them supporting wounded crewmates, emerging from hatches into the late afternoon light and seeing for the first time what their ship looked like from outside the hull. She was going. Everyone could see it. At 19:35 hours, Musashi rolled to port past the point of recovery. She capsized and sank in 1,320 meters of water, taking 1,023 sailors with her to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. On Yamato's bridge, Kurita watched. Nobody spoke. Stop and consider what this man had experienced in the past 36 hours. His flagship sunk beneath him before dawn the previous day. 2 heavy cruisers destroyed in the same ambush. Now Musashi, the ship that had been built as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power, dragged under by aircraft launched from carriers that were never even visible from Yamato's bridge. Every stage of Operation Shō-Gō was coming apart in sequence. The submarines had struck first. Now the aircraft had struck. And San Bernardino Strait, and the American fleet beyond it, still lay ahead. Witnesses aboard Yamato recorded a change in Kurita that became apparent during the air attacks and solidified in their aftermath. The officer who had ordered the surface run through Submarine Alley without visible hesitation had been replaced by someone who moved more slowly through decisions, who asked questions he would previously have answered himself, who stood at the bridge windows and stared at the horizon for intervals that made his staff uneasy. At 15:30, while the attacks were still ongoing, he made a decision that stunned his own officers. He ordered the fleet to reverse course, west, away from San Bernardino Strait, away from Leyte, away from the mission. His staff said nothing immediately. Then his operations officer, Commander Otani, approached him carefully. "Admiral, Tokyo's orders have not changed. The transports at Leyte—" "I am aware of Tokyo's orders," Kurita said. "If we withdraw now, the Southern Force and Admiral Nishimura will reach Leyte Gulf without our support. They will be—" "I am aware." The fleet continued west for 2 hours. Then, as the sun began its descent and the American aircraft returned to their carriers to rearm and refuel, Kurita stood at the bridge windows and looked at the darkening sky over Sibuyan Sea. His operations officer stood 10 feet behind him, waiting. "Come about," Kurita said quietly. "East, maintain speed." Nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke above the necessary minimum. The fleet turned east again, toward San Bernardino Strait, toward the mission that had already cost them so much before the main battle had even been joined. And ahead of them, the strait was dark and unguarded, because Admiral Halsey had taken the bait the Japanese decoy carriers had dangled and was racing north with his entire fleet, leaving the door to Leyte Gulf standing wide open. Kurita slipped through San Bernardino Strait in the darkness with his surviving battleships and cruisers, undiscovered and uncontested, emerging on the far side into the Philippine Sea. Leyte Gulf was ahead of him. The vulnerable American transports were ahead of him. After everything, impossibly, he had arrived at the threshold of the target that Operation Shō-Gō had been designed to destroy. But the admiral who emerged from that strait at midnight was not the admiral who had left Linga Roads. The burning oil off Palawan had done something to him that the American bombs and torpedoes in the Sibuyan Sea had finished. And at dawn on October 25th, when Japanese lookouts spotted ships on the horizon and the great guns of Yamato opened fire, Kurita was about to discover that the Americans waiting for him off the island of Samar were going to fight in a way that no Japanese commander, no military planner in Tokyo, no naval doctrine written in the previous century had ever accounted for. In Part 3, we will watch the smallest American ships in the Pacific charge directly into the guns of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left on Earth, and we will see exactly what happened when an exhausted, frightened admiral looked at the smoke and finally lost his grip on the battle entirely. 2 American submarines, crewed by ordinary men, cracked the spine of Japan's last great offensive in 21 minutes off Palawan. Then carrier aircraft dragged the unsinkable Musashi to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea with 19 torpedo hits. And a broken, exhausted Admiral Kurita slipped through an unguarded San Bernardino Strait in the dark, emerging at dawn on October 25th, with his surviving battleships pointed directly at Leyte Gulf. He had lost his flagship. He had lost Musashi. He had lost the precise timing that Operation Shō-Gō depended upon. But he had arrived. The vulnerable American transports were over the horizon. The prize that Japan had sacrificed thousands of men to reach was within range of Yamato's guns. What waited for him off the island of Samar was not an American fleet. It was 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Ships so lightly armed they had no business being anywhere near a battleship. And the Japanese were about to discover that the most dangerous weapon those tiny ships carried was not a gun or a torpedo. It was the decision their crews had already made before the first shell landed. At 0658 on the morning of October 25th, 1944, Yamato's forward guns fired their opening salvo. The shells, each one weighing as much as a compact automobile, crossed the sky in a shallow arc and struck the water around the American formation in colored columns of spray, red and green and yellow, the Japanese having dyed their shell splashes to help spotters distinguish hits between ships. The colors were almost beautiful from a distance. Aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague looked at those colored columns rising around his formation and understood immediately that he was looking at battleship fire. His first transmission to fleet headquarters was direct to the point of brutality. Under attack by battleships and heavy cruisers. My position, course and speed. He paused for a fraction of a second. Request immediate assistance. No assistance was coming. Halsey was 300 miles to the north chasing empty carriers. The nearest American surface force capable of intervening was hours away. Sprague had 6 escort carriers that could make 18 knots on a good day, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts against 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers. The math produced exactly one possible conclusion. Sprague rejected the conclusion and gave his orders anyway. Make smoke, turn south, launch everything. The carriers began generating black funnel smoke immediately. Dense artificial fog that rolled across the water and began obscuring the Japanese firing solutions. Aircraft that had been spotted on decks loaded with anti-submarine depth charges and light bombs began launching in rapid succession. Pilots climbing into cockpits before they had been fully briefed, some taking off without knowing exactly what they were being sent against. They found out when they crested the smoke and saw Yamato's silhouette below them. Kurita's formation, which had entered the engagement in good tactical order, began encountering its first problem almost immediately. Sprague had turned his force south and southwest, running before the Japanese line, and the pursuit forced Kurita's heavier ships to extend themselves at maximum speed, in a chase formation that gradually stretched and disordered the precise tactical grouping his officers had maintained through the night. By 0730, the neat columns that had left San Bernardino Strait were beginning to spread across 20 miles of ocean in pursuit of ships that kept disappearing into rain squalls and smoke. And then the destroyers turned around. Commander Ernest Evans had been born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, to a Cherokee family. He had joined the Navy in 1931 and had spent 13 years becoming exactly the kind of officer that the Navy created and then forgot about during peacetime. Technically excellent, tactically aggressive, professionally undervalued. When Johnston was commissioned in 1943, Evans had addressed his crew with a speech that none of them forgot. He told them that he intended to go in harm's way, that anyone who was not prepared to do the same was welcome to transfer, and that he expected Johnston to be a fighting ship. He had not been making a speech. He had been stating a fact. At 7:27, Evans ordered Johnston to attack. She turned toward the Japanese line at 30 knots, alone, generating her own smokescreen as she charged. The range to the nearest Japanese heavy cruiser was 18,000 yards in closing. Johnston's 5-inch guns began firing as she ran in, small shells that could not meaningfully damage a cruiser, but could suppress bridge personnel and interfere with fire control. At 10,000 yards, she fired her full torpedo spread of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, and then turned hard to run back into the smoke. She had crossed 12 miles of open water under fire from ships that outweighed her 30 times. 2 of Johnston's torpedoes struck Kumano. The cruiser slowed immediately and dropped out of the pursuit formation, her bow section damaged and flooding. But the attack had done something more important than hit a cruiser. It had forced the entire Japanese formation nearest Johnston to begin evasive maneuvering at the exact moment they needed to be closing the range on the escort carriers. Every ship that turned to avoid Johnston's torpedoes was a ship that was not shooting at Fanshawe Bay. Then Johnston herself was hit. 3 14-inch shells from a Japanese battleship struck her in rapid succession. The first destroyed her engine room. The second knocked out her gyro compass and all power to her steering. The third detonated near the bridge and wounded Evans, destroying the fingers on his left hand and peppering his face and neck with shrapnel. He refused to go below. He gave his orders through the speaking tube in a voice that witnesses described as completely steady. Destroyers Howell and Herman came in next. Howell made a torpedo run at the Japanese battleship column, drawing the fire of Congo and Haruna simultaneously, absorbing hits that progressively destroyed her engine rooms, her gun mounts, her fire control systems. She kept firing with whatever weapons remained functional. By 0855, she had taken over 40 large-caliber hits and was dead in the water. She sank at 0855 with 253 of her crew. Destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, 1,350 tons, built for anti-submarine patrol, made a torpedo run at point-blank range against a column of heavy cruisers. Her crew fired 608 5-inch shells in 55 minutes, a rate of fire that was physically impossible according to the weapon's design specifications, achieved by her ammunition handlers passing shells by hand so fast the system never had a chance to jam. Japanese observers who survived the battle later reported that they had been fighting a heavy cruiser. Samuel B. Roberts was 1/15th the displacement of a heavy cruiser. She sank at 1,005. Above all of it, the aircraft never stopped. Pilots who had expended their bombs and torpedoes made dry runs, diving through anti-aircraft fire with empty bomb bays, pulling up at low altitude, forcing Japanese gunners to track them and fire at them, and break their solutions on the ships below. One pilot radioed that he was making a strafing run with his guns empty. Another dropped his external fuel tanks because he had nothing else to drop. The attacks were not causing decisive damage. They were causing something more valuable in this particular battle. They were causing confusion. On Yamato's bridge, the reports arriving from ship commanders were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. Cruisers were reporting torpedo damage. Destroyers were under attack. Aircraft were striking from multiple directions simultaneously. Ships were maneuvering independently to avoid torpedoes and losing their positions in the formation. Rain squalls were hiding the American carriers for minutes at a time, and every time they reappeared, they were in a slightly different position than expected, because Sprague was using every squall and every smokescreen and every minute of time bought by his destroyers to keep changing his course. Kurita could not form a coherent picture of the battle from the reports reaching him. His communications with individual ship commanders were fragmentary. His cruiser commanders were operating with significant independence, which in a pursuit action against multiple targets produced uncoordinated attacks rather than concentrated overwhelming force. And the sheer volume and aggression of the American response had introduced a question into his mind that grew with every passing minute. What exactly was he fighting? His staff had initially identified the American force as escort carriers. But escort carriers did not fight like this. Escort carriers did not send destroyers charging at battleships. Escort carriers did not have pilots who made attack runs with empty bomb bays. The ferocity of the American response was inconsistent with the force he believed he was engaging, and Kurita, whose confidence had been systematically dismantled over the previous 48 hours, began to suspect that there was something beyond the smoke that he could not see. Fast fleet carriers, perhaps. Halsey's battleships returning from the north. Another trap, like the submarines at Palawan. At 0911, with 3 of his heavy cruisers damaged, with his formation scattered across 30 miles of ocean, with American aircraft still attacking and the American carriers still not sinking, despite everything his fleet had thrown at them, Kurita gave the order that ended the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Turn north. Regroup. Break off the attack. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had left on Earth turned away from the largest prize the Pacific War had offered and began withdrawing. Aboard the battered, burning ships of Taffy 3, sailors who had spent 2 hours expecting to die watched through smoke and spray as the Japanese formation reversed course and disappeared. Sprague reportedly said he could not believe his own eyes. Johnston's survivors, floating in the water after their ship went down, watched Japanese destroyers steam past them without firing. Evans was never found. The strategic result was immediate and total. Kurita's retreat ended Japan's last realistic opportunity to strike the American invasion fleet. By the time he returned through San Bernardino Strait and began the long passage home, the American lodgment on Leyte was secure. MacArthur's forces were ashore. The supply lines were open. The Philippines campaign would continue on American terms. Across all 4 days of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and more than 12,500 sailors. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an offensive force capable of contesting control of the Pacific. It would sortie once more, in April 1945, when Yamato herself was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa with fuel enough only for the outward journey. American carrier aircraft found her in open water and sank her with 10 torpedo hits, taking 3,055 of her crew to the bottom of the East China Sea. The lesson that Musashi had already demonstrated in the Sibuyan Sea was confirmed a second time by her sister ship. The age of the battleship was over. It had ended not with a decisive gun duel between capital ships, which was the scenario that every navy on Earth had spent 50 years preparing for, but with submarines in the dark and aircraft from beyond the horizon. The weapons that every naval establishment had treated as secondary and supplementary had become the primary instruments of naval power, and the weapons that every naval establishment had built its doctrine around had become targets. The Battle of Samar, the engagement that defined those final hours of Leyte Gulf, entered American naval memory as something different from a tactical victory. Taffy 3 had not won in any conventional sense. It had lost 3 ships and more than 1,000 men. What it had done was something harder to measure and more important to preserve. It had demonstrated that the mathematics of a battle, the calculations of tonnage and firepower and speed that should have produced an inevitable outcome, could be overridden by the decision of ordinary men to refuse that outcome. Johnston weighed 2,000 tons. She attacked a fleet that weighed 300,000. She did it because Evans decided she would, and because his crew had heard his speech at commissioning and understood that he meant it. But here is the question that this battle leaves unanswered. The question that historians have been asking for 80 years and that Kurita himself never answered clearly in the 4 decades he lived after the war. What truly happened to the man who survived the burning oil off Palawan, commanded the greatest fleet Japan had left, arrived impossibly at the threshold of his target, and then turned away? In Part 4, we will follow Kurita home, through the silence that followed his return, through the quiet decision the Imperial Navy made about what to do with an admiral who had held the war in his hands and let it go, and through the decades he lived afterward, saying very little, in a Japan that had become something his empire could never have imagined. Because the final chapter of this story is not about ships or battles or numbers. It is about what victory costs the men who almost achieve it, and what history does with the ones it cannot easily judge. 2 American submarines crewed by welders and farm boys cracked Japan's last offensive in 21 minutes. Carrier aircraft dragged Musashi to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea with 19 torpedo hits. And off the island of Samar, the smallest American ships in the Pacific charged directly into the guns of 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, buying enough time and confusion that a broken admiral turned away from the prize his entire mission was built to destroy. Kurita retreated through San Bernardino Strait. Japan lost 34 ships and 12,500 sailors in 4 days. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an offensive force. But the question that Leyte Gulf leaves behind is not about ships or tactics or numbers. It is about the men who made those decisions and what history did with them afterward. Because sometimes the most interesting part of a battle is not what happened during it. It is what happened to the people who survived it. And this story has a final chapter that almost no one expects. Takeo Kurita came home to a Japan that did not know how to receive him. He had not won. He had not died heroically. He had arrived at the threshold of the greatest opportunity the Imperial Navy had been given since Pearl Harbor, and he had turned away from it. And the reasons he gave for doing so were never entirely consistent from one telling to the next. In the culture of the Imperial Japanese military, which had elevated self-sacrifice to the level of religious obligation, survival without victory carried a specific weight that no medal could offset. The Navy's response was quiet and final. There was no court-martial. There was no public condemnation. Those outcomes would have required explanations, and explanations would have required the Navy to examine decisions made at levels above Kurita, including the fundamental premises of Operation Shō-Gō itself. Instead, Kurita was removed from frontline command and appointed superintendent of the Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima, a position of prestige on paper and irrelevance in practice. He spent the final months of the war on land, training cadets for a fleet that no longer existed, teaching the doctrine of a naval power that had already been defeated, watching from a distance as the war he had helped to lose reached its conclusion above the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was 55 years old when Japan surrendered in August 1945. He was healthy, mentally intact, professionally finished. The Navy that had defined every year of his adult life dissolved around him by imperial decree, and Kurita became a civilian in a country that was simultaneously trying to rebuild itself and to understand what it had been. He moved quietly. He gave few interviews. When journalists or historians sought him out in the decades that followed, he received them politely and told them less than they had hoped to hear. The question they always asked was Samar. Why did you turn away? What did you see in the smoke that made you believe the battle was lost when the mathematics still said it was winnable? His answers shifted across the years. Sometimes he cited the air threat, the certainty that American aircraft would destroy his remaining ships before he could accomplish anything decisive at Leyte Gulf. Sometimes he suggested that his communications had been so disrupted that he genuinely could not assess the tactical situation with enough confidence to continue. Sometimes he said almost nothing, looking past his interviewer at something that was not in the room, and the historians wrote down his silence and tried to interpret it later. One Japanese naval historian who interviewed Kurita in the 1960s wrote afterward that the admiral had seemed like a man carrying something he had decided long ago he would never put down and never explain. Whether that thing was guilt or grief, or simply the particular exhaustion of a man who had been floating in burning oil at age 54, watching 300 of his sailors vanish in the dark around him, and who had never fully recovered from that morning, the historian could not say with certainty. Kurita died on December 19, 1977, at the age of 88, in a Japan that had become one of the most economically successful nations on Earth, a country whose post-war identity was built so completely on the rejection of military ambition that the battles Kurita had fought belonged to a world as remote as ancient history. He outlived most of his contemporaries, outlived Yamato, outlived the empire he had served, and carried whatever he knew about Samar into the ground with him. The physical legacy of Leyte Gulf was measured and documented within months of the battle's conclusion. American naval analysts who assessed the action identified its central lesson with a clarity that left no room for argument. The battleship was finished as the primary instrument of naval power, and the two weapons that had killed it, the submarine and the carrier aircraft, were the foundation on which every future navy would be built. The United States Navy acted on this lesson faster than any other institution in history has ever absorbed and implemented a strategic lesson of comparable magnitude. Within 5 years of Leyte Gulf, American battleship construction had effectively ended. The Iowa-class battleships that survived the war were placed in reserve, brought out periodically for shore bombardment in Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf War, but never again considered the center of naval power. The carriers and submarines that had ended the Imperial Japanese Navy became the organizing principle around which American naval strategy was built for the next 8 decades. The submarine legacy was perhaps the more profound of the two. The principle that Darter and Dace had demonstrated off Palawan, that a small vessel operating in concealment could destroy a capital ship before the capital ship knew it was under threat, became the defining logic of naval deterrence in the nuclear age. By 1960, the United States had deployed the first Polaris missile submarines, vessels that could remain submerged for months, and launch ballistic missiles from beneath the ocean's surface to targets thousands of miles away. The Soviet Union built its own fleet of nuclear submarines in response. Every major naval power on Earth structured its underwater forces around the principle that 2 submarine commanders had proven in 21 minutes in the dark off Palawan. Today, the United States Navy operates 71 submarines, none of them powered by the diesel engines that drove Darter and Dace through the darkness on October 23, 1944. The nuclear attack submarines that form the backbone of American undersea power can remain submerged for months, travel at speeds that would have seemed impossible in 1944, and carry weapon systems of a sophistication that McClintock and Claggett could not have imagined. But the fundamental tactical principle, find the enemy before the enemy finds you, position yourself for the attack before you are detected, strike from concealment, and withdraw, is unchanged from the doctrine those 2 commanders executed against Kurita's fleet. The aircraft carrier legacy is equally visible. In 1944, the United States Navy operated 28 fleet carriers. Today, it operates 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers, each one displacing 100,000 tons, each one carrying a wing of aircraft capable of striking targets 1,000 miles away, each one protected by a battle group of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that together constitute the most powerful mobile military force in human history. The Carrier Battle Group, organized around the principle that air power projected from the sea can defeat any surface force, is a direct institutional descendant of the lesson that American carrier aircraft taught the Imperial Japanese Navy in the waters of the Sibuyan Sea. 11 nations now operate aircraft carriers. Every one of them built their carrier doctrine on the evidence provided by the Pacific War, and specifically by the engagement record of battles like Leyte Gulf, where carrier aviation demonstrated beyond any remaining argument that it was the decisive instrument of naval combat. The deeper lesson of Leyte Gulf, the one that sits beneath the strategic and technological conclusions, is about the nature of institutional resistance to ideas that challenge existing doctrine. In 1944, the Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic identity around the battleship and the decisive fleet engagement. This was not an irrational choice at the time it was made. Battleships had been the dominant form of naval power for decades. The doctrine that organized everything around them had been developed and refined by intelligent, experienced officers who had thought carefully about the problem of naval warfare. The institution had invested enormous resources, both material and psychological, in the correctness of this doctrine. And then the world changed faster than the institution could adapt. The submarines and aircraft that ended Japanese naval power were not new technologies in 1944. American submarines had been operating in the Pacific since December 1941. American carrier aviation had demonstrated its potential at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942. The evidence that the battleship's era was ending had been accumulating for years. But the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to organize its strategy around the battleship because the institution could not absorb the implications of the evidence without simultaneously admitting that everything it had built and believed and invested in was wrong. This is not a uniquely Japanese failure. It is the standard failure of institutions facing disruptive change, and it appears with remarkable consistency across military history. The French Army in 1940 had seen the evidence of armored warfare demonstrated in Spain and Poland, and still organized its defenses around the static doctrines of the previous war. The British Army, in the early years of the First World War, continued sending infantry across open ground against machine guns long after the evidence of those attacks had made their futility mathematically undeniable. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute something close to a law of institutional behavior. What makes the Leyte Gulf story unusual is not that the Japanese Navy failed to adapt in time. That failure was predictable. What is unusual is the clarity with which the battle demonstrated the consequence of that failure, and the speed with which the winning side drew the correct conclusions and implemented them. Now, here is the detail that most accounts of Leyte Gulf leave out entirely, the one that brings the full story into a focus that changes how you see everything that came before it. When historians and naval analysts began the serious work of examining the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the decades after the war, they focused their attention, naturally enough, on the largest engagements. The air attacks on Musashi, the stand at Samar, Kurita's retreat. These were the dramatic centerpieces of a 4-day battle that involved hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. What received less attention was the question of what would have happened if McClintock had not made his radio transmission. When Darter's radar first picked up Kurita's fleet in the darkness of October 23rd, McClintock faced two distinct decisions. The first was whether to attack. The second was whether to report. Reporting meant breaking radio silence in waters where Japanese direction-finding equipment might locate him. It meant revealing not just the existence of the contact, but the fact that American submarines were operating in the area, potentially causing Kurita to take additional precautions. There was a legitimate tactical argument for staying silent, attacking from concealment, and reporting only after the engagement was complete. McClintock reported immediately. He transmitted the contact report that reached Admiral Halsey's headquarters hours before the Japanese had any idea they had been spotted. That transmission is what allowed American carrier groups to launch search aircraft at first light, find Kurita's formation early, and begin the sustained air assault that killed Musashi and consumed 7 hours of Kurita's operational schedule. Without that transmission, the air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea might have begun too late to cause the damage and delay that left Kurita psychologically shattered before he ever reached San Bernardino Strait. The man who found Kurita's fleet had the instinct not just to attack it, but to tell everyone else where it was. That instinct, to share the intelligence rather than hoard it, to sacrifice tactical concealment for strategic communication, was the decision that set every subsequent event in motion. And it was made in approximately 30 seconds by a submarine commander from the American Midwest who had never commanded anything larger than a submarine, in the dark, with no time to consult anyone, based entirely on his own judgment. The whole arc of this story begins and ends in the same place. Not in the headquarters where admirals planned operations. Not in the shipyards where engineers built battleships. Not in the strategic arguments about carrier versus battleship that had been ongoing for 20 years before the war. It begins and ends with an ordinary man making a decision under pressure that he could not have known would echo through the rest of the century. From 2 submarines crewed by mechanics and farm boys, to the permanent restructuring of every major navy on Earth. From 21 minutes in the dark off Palawan, to a strategic lesson that 8 decades of technological change has not superseded. From McClintock's instinct to share what he had found, to a principle of combined arms naval warfare that still governs how the most powerful fleets in history are organized and deployed today. The ocean off Palawan is very deep. Otago is still down there, along with the 300 men who went down with her, and the operational plans that Kurita carried aboard her, and the certainty that Operation Shō-Gō had once seemed to offer. Musashi is in the Sibuyan Sea at a depth of 1,320 meters, found by a private expedition in 2015, resting on her side in the darkness. Yamato is in the East China Sea, 3 miles down, in pieces, because the magazine explosion that finally killed her was large enough to break the largest battleship ever built into fragments. The ships are monuments now. Monuments to a way of thinking about war that the war itself proved wrong, sunk by the weapons everyone underestimated, by the men nobody in Tokyo had ever heard of. In the dark, before anyone was watching. History does not always announce its turning points in advance. Sometimes they happen in silence, beneath dark water, in the span of 21 minutes that the people involved had no way of knowing would matter for the next 80 years. The future did not belong to the strongest fleet. It belonged to the 2 commanders who found the strongest fleet in the dark and decided in 30 seconds to tell the world exactly where it was.